Greetings and welcome to our first ever live stream for Drawing 1 at Clark College with Grant Hottle. That's me. And what we're going to talk about today is shading in graphite. This is to go along with your week 2 project, which will be drawing a still life with 3 fruits or veggies in graphite and doing a full grayscale gradient of that approach. Now, as I talk today about class, please, if you come across any questions or anything like that, put them in the live chat, those of you who are here live. And if you're watching the recording on our Canvas session, please just email me any questions that you have as we go. One of the things that I think becomes really crucial when you're starting this week's project is that you don't forget all of the things that we've been practicing in week 1 when it comes to proportion, when it comes to contour lines, cross contour lines, and really focusing on trying to get your planar analysis, your understanding of the shapes of the form into place, as well as the shading. So you don't want to just have a really good or really vibrant grayscale, I guess you could say, if your forms, your proportion are not correct as you go across the rest of your forms. Now, for my little demo that I want to do for you today, I'm going to draw this bobcat skull that I have in my studio. Here it is right here. And I just took a photo of it so that you guys could see the same thing that I'm seeing when I look up at it. And I'm going to draw it in graphite. I have a few different pencils that I'll be using. I'll be doing most of my sketching with a 3B. Now this is a little darker than I recommend that you start with, and that's because it'll pick up on my webcam a little bit better for you to be able to see. For your own work, I recommend that you start with an HB or lighter. An HB or lighter. HB is a number 2 pencil, so that's, it could be like your yellow Ticonderoga pencil or a mechanical pencil if you prefer, and lay those in with light marks so that you can make corrections and erase as you go, and then start to work in your shading. So I'm going to work in a 3B to sketch, and then I'll jump up very quickly to my darkest pencil. This is a 6B. It's the darkest one I'll be using today, and then I'll kind of bounce back and forth, and I'm going to talk about some different shading techniques as I go. So let me just check in with everybody. Good. And we will get started on this sketch. So here at the very beginning, I'm just going to start by kind of scribbling in my marks. And as I draw, I'll try and tell you and keep you informed of what my thought process is as I work. Good work on your week 1 projects, by the way. I was very pleased with some of the images that I've seen of your shoes and your contour and cross contour lines. I'll try and do a little bit of refresher on that as I work here today, as well as it makes sense to do so. So you can see right off the bat that I'm being very loose with this sketching stage. And this is what I call in class drawing from the general to the specific. So I'm trying to really just block in very, very loosely some of the forms that I need across this, and just like get my marks in place. And I will sometimes put little notations for myself, little measurement ticks, like say the outside edge of that form to the outside edge of the nasal cavity there on the bobcat. And I'll just do kind of quick little measurements. If I have to, I'll use the measuring and sighting techniques that we discussed last week. But here at the outset, what I'm doing is I'm bouncing around and I'm trying to let my hand and my eye really work together, get loosened up, make sure I'm thinking about center of mass. I'll talk about that again in just a second. And just try and block in everything that I'm going to need to make a good drawing as I continue to work. And here at this early stage, I don't want to fall in love with anything yet, because I want to feel comfortable. If I realize that I've made a mistake proportionally, I want to make sure that I feel comfortable just changing that and not trying to hold on to something that was incorrectly proportioned or that's just, in the wrong spot. I want to move things around as I go. You might hear some sounds from other parts of the house while I'm working. Like most of you, I'm not alone in working from home during the pandemic. So you might hear a cat or a dog or a door opening or something. I'm sure many of you are in similar positions. So I'm feeling okay about my proportions of this. So let me talk just really briefly about, I use this term center of mass. And hopefully you can also see how much my head is kind of bouncing back and forth between my drawing and my subject, which for me is an image on my computer screen, the same image that you're looking at in this live stream. And I want to do that a lot. I want to look back and forth because I need to make sure that I'm not just looking too much at my own piece of paper. If I do too much of that, what will happen is I'll ignore something. The more I look down at my paper, the more I'm going to be remembering what it was I saw instead of looking and judging at what I was looking at the time of working. Each time that I'm using my memory instead of my eyes, there's a good chance that my brain is going to trick me into making some incorrect assumptions about what it is that I'm drawing. Now, part of the goals here is to constantly simplify. All drawing is simplification, okay? So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take this really complex shape of this bobcat skull, and I'm trying to simplify it. So the first thing that I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about the general shape, which is almost like an oval or a circle, and then I'm trying to break that down a little bit at a time into things that look a little bit more formed or three-dimensional. And some of the things that will help me do that is finding the center of mass. Now, I'm really lucky here because in this skull, you have a center of mass that runs right along the middle of the whole skull like this. It's not the middle in terms of the middle of my shape, which would be somewhere here, but it cuts down the middle of the face. And you can see there's a joint that goes right down the nasal bone of the bobcat and even connects through the front teeth. And that's my center of mass. It's also a really great cross contour line that I will be sure to use as I continue to work on the rest of my drawing. But for right now, I want to make sure that this center of mass is closer to my left edge than to my right, to make sure that it feels like the form that I'm drawing is turned to the side. So one of your first mistakes that you might make, those of you who are true beginners just getting started, is trying to put this center line too close to the middle of your actual form. You need to make sure that it's lined up properly to the outside edge so that when you start to break in the rest of those marks, you have the room to do so. Okay, makes sense? So now for a little bit more work on this. I'm feeling pretty good about my shapes, so I don't want to wait too much longer to start blocking in some of my shapes of value. You're going to hear me say this term several times through today's live stream, and that's because, and I want you to really internalize this idea, it is much easier to draw a shape than it is to draw a thing. So if in this case, if I'm thinking of like, I've got to draw the nose cavity of this animal, well, that's pretty hard. Like, it sounds complex because it is complex. But if what I do is I think in terms of drawing this kind of heart shape at the top, and I kind of ignore what it is, it gets much more simple in my own mind. The same thing is true for pretty subtle variations in shadow. So I'm just going to block in a few chunks of shadow here. And the more that I draw on this, the better it'll start to look. I know that my webcam is a little on the blurry side when it comes down to what's on the paper. As it tightens up and gets a little darker, I think it'll look a little bit better. So here at the start, all I'm doing is I'm drawing the side of my pencil lead a little bit, doing a little bit of shading. Some of the videos that I posted online will talk about pencil grip. I sometimes use a writer's grip like this. This is probably my most common, but I do hold the pencil a little further back than many of you will, and that lets me get bigger motions than if I'm holding it right up on top. I also tend to let the pencil edge not the tip, do a lot of the work when I'm shading. That kind of smooths things out a little bit as you work across. And sometimes I'll hold it in like an overhand grip like this, which is really, really common when I'm drawing with charcoal, which I won't be using today. But my charcoal grip is entirely overhand usually, unless I'm doing some tiny little detail. So with the pencil, I like to hold it back a little bit further than is common. And then I shade with the side of the pencil a little bit as I go. And again, always taking little quick notations about how close something is to an edge, double checking my proportion, always pushing things around. I am a firm believer that drawing, kind of like writing, is really about editing. It's about kind of correcting and pushing around all the different forms that you're working with as you go. And you don't want to be bogged into trying to have a perfect form at the start. You want to be able to kind of find the form through a series of moves that you work as you go. Now, one really important key to shading that I'm going to talk about today is looking for points of contrast, places where a value, light or dark, of an object really shifts considerably from its surroundings. And that means that I'm constantly going to need to be kind of comparing my shapes of value one to the other, okay? And looking at one little section and asking how light or dark is that compared to the things right next to it. And kind of in order to practice what I preach, I want to bounce around a little bit, look at all my areas, not get too bogged down in any one area until I'm really happy with what I've been working at. And you'll see when I make a decision here in a couple of minutes what it'll look like when I really kind of commit to something. Right now I'm just kind of laying in some big blocks of light gray, still drawing with a 3B pencil right now, but I kind of am getting excited about the idea of shifting to a darker pencil very quickly. But I'm just wanting to kind of block in the shapes that I need and note for myself where those forms are going to happen. And I'm also kind of sitting myself forward and back as I work so that I can get a better view on my drawing and kind of understand the pieces that I'm trying to look at and make sure that I'm not missing something as I go. You notice that I'm also not getting super bogged down yet in like shapes of teeth or anything like that. Like that'll come a little later. I'm just putting in some quick notations here and there. And I'm also starting to think a little bit about the direction of the skull, like the direction of the marks I want to make. I will kind of redefine a lot of the forms that I've shaded as the drawing progresses by creating some marks that are a little bit more solid, a little bit more direct, kind of cross contour lines, hatching, cross hatching, than this initial kind of fuzzy look of things. But I want to start by just kind of finding my space, finding my way around the things, and really thinking about how things are going. Okay, let's dive into some darker marks. I'm going to grab my 6B. My 6B is going to be the darkest pencil I'm going to use today. And I want you to see how much longer I've shaded the lead. Sharpened the lead. This is a really long mark across it. That lets me really kind of get sideways on things and just kind of rub in as I go. And I'm going to go ahead and mark. I'm going to make a hard decision here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of use my eraser to correct a little bit of a mistake, I think, in the shape of that nasal cavity. And as soon as I'm happy with that shape, I want to put in some darkness that will represent what black looks like in this drawing to me. And you'll see why I do that pretty quickly. And it's because I want to make sure that I don't wait too long to put in some darks, because I want to make sure that I shade the entire drawing towards that end of the value scale, so that whatever I decide is going to be my darkest mark needs to be established pretty soon. Otherwise, you run the risk of, at the end of the drawing, you put in something really, really dark where there's a black thing, and it makes everything else look really washed out, like you've kind of poked a hole in your paper. So I'm just really trying to focus on the negative space. Negative space is the space around an object. So I'm looking at this little shape of bone right here, that white space, kind of a triangle, and the negative space is the space on both sides of it, and that's what's helping me to define that form. I'm not pressing quite as hard. I'm pulling up a little bit as I shade down into that lighter zone, and this should start to create a nice amount of contrast. And I'm going to still stay kind of loosey-goosey in there as I go. Now, right now, I'm not using my fingers to smear, and I'm not using a chamois, and I'm not using a smudging stick. All of those are options. If you want to smear, you can. You just have to remember to clean up after the fact. I'll show you a little section of that in a little bit, just so that those of you who are using it can. But what I'm really trying to do is use different pressures with my pencil and my lead to create slightly subtly different marks as I go, so that the building of like a subtle variation in value happens just with the tip of the pencil. But there's a lot of different ways to do that. Many of them are outlined in this week's lessons. So take a look, try a bunch of them, use your sketchbook and practice some things out and see how you're feeling. What are your favorites? Which ones work the best for you? And then recognize too that as an artist, you're always constantly deciding which style to use for what purpose. And I will use stippling or cross-hatching or very subtle shading methods based on what my goals are with the thing I'm drawing. And I'll change my mind. I don't just always draw the exact same way, right? Because not every drawing calls for the same method. By the way, when you're drawing in graphite and you're setting your hand down on things, it's really useful to have a paper towel or a sheet of paper, something to set your hand on, so that you're not constantly dragging your hand back across your own drawing. So as I'm kind of moving up to this little dark space, this negative space here behind the eye socket, I'm gonna put my hand on a piece of paper towel so that I can not drag through the drawing. Again, I'm holding my pencil pretty far back. This lets me have a little bit of a side angle on the shading. Try not to look for too long at my paper before checking back in with the rest of my drawing, with my image. Now, eye exercises. How do you get your eyes to see subtle variation in value more readily? It's a tricky situation that you have to practice a lot, but it's something that you can get better at the more that you work. I'm just going to kind of let that sit for a moment. I'll come back to it in a bit. One thing that I do a lot is I wind up kind of squinting my eyes, taking like a soft focus on whatever it is I'm looking at. If you're nearsighted like I am, you can also look over the top of your glasses and just take that soft edge approach to whatever it is that you're drawing, so that you can start to see the ways in which a shape of value, a shape that's like lighter or darker than the shapes next to it, actually is more subtle than you sometimes notice, you know? And that you want to pay attention to that as you work and not just focus entirely on like the biggest areas and exaggerations that you kind of pull up. It's very easy to get bogged down in detail. Okay, here's where we're kind of starting to get to. I've been drawing for about 12 minutes, 10 or 12 minutes. And so you can hopefully start to see at this moment how like the drawing can start to take shape from here. Little notations for myself that I would still really want to pay attention to. The tabletop itself, the block that the skull is sitting on, cast shadow, light source, anchoring here, there, and the other, making quick notation of like where is the front edge of the block. If I draw a line straight up from it, like a plumb line, where does it intersect with the eye socket? How wide out does my eye socket flail? Flare, I guess, is a better use of that word. And so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things that I still want to be paying attention to as I sketch. I don't want to just kind of ignore those things and get too bogged down in the kind of noodling, the nitpicky stuff of drawing. You need the nitpicky stuff, but it can't get in the way of all the other forms that you need to work with. And it will if you let it. If you let it, it'll become difficult to see what you were thinking of. You'll miss something being out of proportion, and it'll harm the drawing. So I'm pretty happy with some of these blocked in shapes, but I think they're getting a little messy over in this area right here. You can kind of see that it's a little blurry. So I want to crisp this up a little bit by going back to my dark pencil, and I'm going to grab a little bit of the negative space around the outside of the form. And so here's another great example of looking at a shape versus a form. The form, the far side of this skull, pretty difficult to draw. The shape of the negative space behind it, that's kind of like just this like triangle of that black back here, very easy to draw by comparison. So that's what I'm gonna work with. I'm just gonna quickly grab that and use that as a chance to crisp up my drawing a touch. So what happens when you make a mistake, or you go too dark, or you ignore something that you wish you hadn't ignored? What do you do next? You know, I think a lot of students really kind of operate from a position of worry that they're going to make a mistake and they're not going to know how to fix it, and they might wreck their drawing. So let me talk about that just really briefly by grabbing one of my favorite tools in all of drawing, a kneaded eraser. Kneaded eraser is your gray eraser that I had you buy. You can break it down into smaller shapes, and I like to not have this like huge chunk in my hand. I like a small thing like this. And I can take it and then find a little spot. So what I'm noticing is that this outside edge right there of the skull that's light, you'll notice in the photograph, there's a little bit of a glowing kind of lighter value. It's not quite white, but it's a glowing lighter value on that outside edge. And I've got it a little too dark right there. So this is a perfect device to work with. So I'm going to make a little tight, and it might take a couple because there's quite a bit of lead there. I'm just going to come in and just kind of pull it back out. Can you see that? Get a little bit of light back, bouncing back into it. And while I'm there, I can go ahead and use it to pull in a little bit of light source across the front of the nasal cavity. And I'm going to take this line of this joint of the skull up, and I'm going to go ahead and darken around as I go. This is where you get to be a little bit nitpicky if you want. If you want to be kind of hard on yourself about your shapes and forms, this is a good time to do that when you break out the eraser. I'm not really thinking of it as a correcting tool. I know I said that, what happens if you make a mistake. I'm really thinking of it as a drawing tool. My pencil takes the white of the paper and turns it gray. My eraser takes a dark gray and makes it a light gray. Okay, so like it's more like I'm thinking of like I push with the pencil, I pull with the eraser until my value sets are closer to what my eyes are picking up, especially when I'm kind of looking at the object with a little bit of a blurry start. And those combinations together will help me get a lot closer to something that approximates reality or a clear vision of what we're seeing. I don't always love the term realistic when it comes to drawing and painting. I think a lot of people say things like photorealistic, and what they really mean is that it kind of fools the eye. The French even have a term for this in art called trompe l'oeil, and it literally means fool the eye. And I think that it's important. I want my drawings to look like drawings. I don't want them to look like photographs. There's a whole movement of artists who work to try and make their art, paintings, drawings, etc., look like photographs. They have depth of field. They have like a focal point that is very much based in the camera, and they are always rendered from photograph. Well, I don't want to say always. Almost always rendered from photographic sources, not from your eyes. I like drawings and my own drawings to look like a drawing, to look different than a photograph. But that doesn't mean that I don't want them to have some elements of what you might call realism or naturalism to them. It's just that I don't want that to be, that's not my overwhelming force. Other things that excite me about drawing are mark making, abstraction, simplification, style, emotion, all of these things that don't really have anything to do with that naturalist or photorealistic approach to rendering. So think about that for yourself. What are your goals? What are the artists who excite you? How do they work? And what are the things that you want that you yourself want to make happen in your own drawings? And you can kind of see how this is starting to shape up a little bit. I'm going to try and do a kind of a quick all over because I don't intend to make this drawing last, for as long as it would take to probably do the entire skull, an hour and a half or something like that. I'll probably just draw for 40 minutes or so, 30 or 40 minutes, and try and give you enough pointers along the way that it will help as you draw your own still life setup as you work. Now, this is a great example of finding something in the form that functions like a cross contour mark. This excellent center of mass line. I warned you that I might need to use it again to help to kind of drive home the sense that there is depth across this form. And so that's what I'm doing right now. If you find a lot of this really difficult, be sure to watch all the videos posted for this week, including ones on drawing really simple shapes like circles or spheres and cubes and shading them. I think that you need to get good at breaking down complex shapes into simple shapes and then rendering that again and again. And but I also don't want you, I think there's a little too much fear in art when students get started on a project. They want to feel like they've got everything figured out in the right order. Like, I need to do this first, and then I do this next, and then I do this next. And there's something that you will learn so nicely just by diving in and making a bad drawing. There's nothing wrong with making a bad drawing. Making a bad drawing is good. It's how you learn. It's how you figure out what went wrong. But you have to be aware. You have to be critical of yourself. And I don't mean hard on yourself. Sometimes you need to be hard on yourself. But what I mean by critical is understand, think, use your brain. What worked, what didn't? How can I change what didn't work into what will work in the future? And that requires practice. Some of you may be athletes. Imagine trying to learn how to swing a golf club or hit a baseball and trying to do that like mentally, theoretically, instead of getting in the batting cage and trying to hit the ball and then having somebody watch your swing and say, you're moving your head too much, or you're taking your eye off the ball, or you're not stepping with your foot before you swing. And all of those kinds of things, you have to be your own kind of source for that. You need to think for yourself, what am I doing wrong? Why is my shading, really liney? Is it distracting from the rest of the forms because it's not smooth enough? Well, how can I smooth out my shading? What are some of my techniques that I might be able to use that will help with that? Because you don't want to just keep doing the same thing over and over again. Those of you who have a lot of experience drawing, who've done this a lot of, done these kinds of shadings a lot, some of you probably have. Same thing is true for you. Try not to get complacent. Try not to bog yourself down in what you tend to do, and make sure that you're still just as critical of yourself now as we would expect a beginner to be. How can you improve? What's your mistake? Where do you always go wrong? and then try and work kind of forwards and backwards at the same time. Ask yourself, what mistakes do you make, and then how do you get around to fixing them? So hopefully you can kind of see how the forms are starting to shape up. This is a good time for me to also kind of take a moment and just ask, like, are individual things light or darker than each other? Like this right here, right now, is almost the, like I think some of these light marks are a little too light. And so as I try and get a little bit more and more kind of precise as I draw, I'll probably try and make certain things pop out a little bit more, a little bit less. Focus a little bit more on some highlights and marks like that as you go. But for right now, quick sketch, trying to just get through this so that you guys have some insight as to how to get your work done this weekend. I'm feeling okay with this. It's not the best drawing I've ever made, but it's probably not the worst. Let's talk about a really simple shading move that you'll use again and again to just try and make sure things look rounded. Okay, so right now I'm working on this section of this orbital bone. This is like it connects to what's called the zygomatic arch. It's basically the cheekbone, how the cheekbone wraps around the outside edge of the orbital socket where the eye goes. And it kind of makes if I really make it angular, it does this. And I want to actually think of it as this really angular form for a minute as I start to shade, because it allows me to say, okay, this inside plane is being hit by shadow from my top down light source, my far right light source. So it's striking here and it's casting a shadow. Now you can see me handling the exact same situation in a slightly more subtle way right here. This is the bit that I was talking about, and this kind of jagged edge of the orbital socket, that's where it's broken off, that the skull's broken a little bit. But I've got this really nice cast shadow on the inside of the form, and then I can come in with my eraser and pull out a little bit of the light on the other side of that to really kind of drive home a sense of the contrast of what it's like on either side of a light form. Hope that makes some sense. So don't be afraid to simplify, to look for some areas in your drawing where you can say, hey, you know what, like this basically looks like a box, so I'm going to draw it like a box, and then I'm going to fix that out. Okay, I think what I'm going to do is wrap up this drawing for now, and then I'll just let anyone who is watching this as a recording later on, let me know if you have questions as you work, and I'll try and come back in and help out. I'll also post this, a better photo of the drawing as it stands on our canvas shell, so that you can see a little bit of the mark making that it's harder to see in this image over here, and it'll hopefully help you have some standpoints, some things that you can use as you work on your own still lives. as the week progresses. And I think you're going to have some fun with this project. I posted a couple student images from Michelle Raymond's class. This is a project that her class uses almost every term. It's a great one. And I want you to think a little bit about how, about the images, about the vegetables and fruits that you pick and how you lay them out into something interesting, and try and have fun, be creative, try and make the best drawing that you can make. Really take your time with it. This is going to be a slow process. You can see I have a lot of practice doing this sort of thing, and you could tell that this drawing, I could probably spend 2 hours on this drawing and still have some room to go in terms of precision. I've spent a little over 30 minutes on it right now, and I think the way that I would tend to go is I'd say it's about halfway there. But you could really, double it up, quadruple it up if you wanted to. So something to think about in your own drawing, and don't hesitate to really push yourself, try and have some fun with it. And if you run into snags, you're having a hard time figuring out how to draw a pumpkin or a rutabaga or whatever the heck you got at the grocery store, shoot me an image of it, take a photo of it, shoot me an email, and let's try and work it out together. We can always do a one-on-one Zoom and talk about your drawing and help you figure out how to do it, okay? So try not to be too intimidated by it. It is difficult. It's meant to be difficult, but it's not meant to be impossible, and you can handle this. It's a thing that you can do, okay? It just takes practice, and you got to start by trying it. So thank you all so much for joining me today for our live stream, and I'll look forward to your questions online later. Thanks a bunch, y'all. This has been Grant signing off.